All right, to get your attention, this outfit is for a reason. Does anybody know? Let's go O's! Tonight is a very important game. So I'm really, really pleased to be moderating this session. And we're going to be focusing around community engagement. And so we'll start out with each of you giving your own introduction, and then we'll turn to our questions. So Fred?
So I'm Fred Tutman, been the Patuxent Riverkeeper for 20 years as of 2024, what was supposed to be a 5-year gig. That's pretty much it. I would say we prioritize our work with communities that are suffering, that have environmental disparities.
Hi everyone, my name is Brianna Yancey. As Laura mentioned, I'm a NOAA Knauss Fellow. I work at their Atlantic Oceanographic and Meteorological Lab on research to operation transitions, and prior to that, I've done a lot of diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice work in the Chesapeake Bay area.
Thank you. And I'm Frederica Mosher. I'm the director of Maryland Sea Grant. I've been at Sea Grant a long time. I've been the director for 12 years. And we focus a lot on outreach and education, research, and communications. So glad to be here. Thank you.
How can we communicate ideas of big data and cyber infrastructure so that they are accessible and meaningful to broader audiences?
Does it matter who starts?
No, go for it, Fred.
So we actually talked about this in one of the breakout groups, that plain speak is better in the sense that it doesn't create this insider-outsider effect. The people who are outside don't have the jargon, don't have the connection to the subject matter, and so they become alienated from it because they have to get on your page just to understand what you're talking about. So to the extent that we can, I think the analogy I used was selling the sizzle and not the steak. You know, the sizzle is the thing that is the benefit, and you can talk about that often enough in plain speak, whereas the steak is the details, the accurate, the correct acronym or the right word. So I think you have to be a little broad-minded and be mindful of whom you're talking to, not talking down, not dumbing it down, but translating it so that it's accessible, or you'll lose folks pretty quick.
Brianna?
Yeah, when I think about this question, I think we need to remind ourselves one of the reasons why we have jargon is to make sure that we are all on the same page. When I think about like the scientific name for certain animals, but when you think of like a puma or mountain lion or a cougar, and then you think about their scientific name, which I think is like puma concolor or something like that, I hope I didn't get it wrong. We all know that we're talking about the same thing, and it doesn't matter what region you're from or what language you use. You're not going to tell somebody, this is absolutely not a mountain lion, get out of my face, is a puma. You're going to accept that language. So it's important to be able to say, like, yes, I know the scientific jargon, but also I know the plain language, I know what you're talking about when you're communicating with me, and it's a back and forth and that kind of like shared language.
Great. Frederica, do you have thoughts on this?
So it's just creating unnecessary barriers. And it's exclusionary when you want to be inclusionary, to use jargon. And it's a good way to get around it. As a colleague said to me yesterday, cyber infrastructure, well, that's your phone. Like, okay, that's accessible for a lot of people. So I think we really need to be very mindful of who we want to talk with and find out what their questions are and why there's a so what or a ... and when we start these conversations.
So can I add to that? Because I've encountered lots of languages that aren't written down. Wolof in Senegal, Mende. If you saw the movie Blood Diamond, they speak a lot of Mende, a language I learned as a boy, but it's never been written down. And so in those languages, you find that people do find that kind of common ground, because the implications of inventing a new word is kind of bizarre if you think about it. You can't go anywhere with it because the language itself, you know what I mean, is not evolving quite the same way as us. We invent new words just about every day, I think, in English. You have to really race to keep up. So I don't want to lose that train, that we have a particular thing in English. Not everybody's on that page.
That's a great point. And especially in the Maryland region, we also need to think in a bilingual sense for some of the communities who may be reached, so extending that here makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, in fact, when I saw that movie, I said, I know what they're saying! Shh, shh, sit down, sit down. It's in the movie theater.
All right, so once we have found in this breakout room how we're going to communicate all of these ideas, so let's assume everyone in the next session is incredibly productive and we find awesome tools for helping this to happen. A second opportunity emerges for including diverse voices in the pursuit of this use-inspired research who've not previously been at the table. And I think, Fred, of your published work on this, particularly in the Chesapeake region, and why it's so important you're talking with us about this now. So especially when there's a documented digital divide, when there's people who have felt left out and disempowered, how do we ensure that those communities have been under-resourced and marginalized can get a table at the collaboratory? This is a big one. So we are really putting you on the spot, but big, hairy ideas are welcome.
Somebody else want to start first? Or?
I can start. So I think one thing that we tend to overlook is that there are people that represent marginalized identities that do have access to these opportunities that sometimes get excluded as like kind of like a first stepping stone to having more inclusion, and then broadening and creating more opportunities for people who have like larger or more barriers to accessing it. So it's definitely like kind of like a step ladder. Whereas like we make a lot of assumptions about people that have marginalized identities and saying like, oh, well, they don't have the capacity or they don't have the ability or the funds or the resources, but there are a lot of people who do have the degree or the money or the access that represent these identities that you could start with. So just kind of breaking through those assumptions that you have about people who represent marginalized identities.
Yeah, that's great. There are scientists in these communities, there are data, cyber infrastructure folks in these communities, and we can't all of a sudden put it into an us and them when that's not the reality. Thanks, Brianna.
I agree with Brianna 100% here, and I'm reminded of Mamie Parker once said to me, and some of you might know her, she used to be head of U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, but she said, we're talking about underestimated communities. And reaching out to communities that we haven't usually worked with is not it's not the community's problem, it's our problem. And it's a problem that we need to solve. And if we're reaching out with our new ideas and our use of a cyber collaboratory, we need to be certain that if we think we're solving people's problems, those people need to be in the room and given equal voice to state what actually their problems are. We need to really shift our focus away from assuming that we know what other people think, because we're a pretty homogeneous group here, and you can be certain that we don't know what people think in the Chesapeake Bay, let alone the globe.
So one thing I bumped into, there are words and concepts that we think we use them in a certain way, but they're not portable in that people draw a different context. The first one that comes to mind is the idea of public transportation, something environmentalists always lobby for all kinds of reasons, carbon footprint and all that stuff. In some of the communities we've interacted with, riding public transportation comes with a stigma. It means you can't afford a car. Right? I got a car. I want people to know I have a car. It's a luxury to get in my car and drive to where I'm going. And so the idea is not, it doesn't instantly crystallize for people why public transportation is a good idea, because they may have a very different context for that very concept. So be mindful, I think, this is what I think we have to do, is be kind of mindful of our cultural context. Don't assume, what do they say in The Princess Bride? I don't think that word means exactly what you think it means, right? Sometimes that's true. Sometimes that's really true, that we're using words that are the right words, but that's the wrong crowd for that particular set of words if we want them to draw the inference, the meaning that we intend. And I think that's huge. I think that's really, really huge. And people are defensive about it, right? Well, I used the right word and the right, yeah, but it wasn't for that crowd. They have a different association for that idea. So it's a mindfulness thing.
Yeah, I love this conversation because it's asset-based framing for these communities. And I've found that historically there's been much more of a tendency to think, well, we have knowledge we're putting out in a unidirectional way. And what you all are saying is, no, actually this is an enriching enriching approach that can actually add resources, cultural wealth of knowledge, and a lot of benefits. We need everyone at the table. We just need everyone at the table. So let's get into the nitty gritty. This is the stuff, I'm such a pragmatist that this question is my selfish question, which is, okay, we've talked philosophically a little bit about this, but what are the nitty gritty structures and barriers for a center like the Collaboratory to authentically and equitably engage? So what do we need in place? What are the actual practices? Who are the people we need? How would we actually do this to connect what you heard this morning to the communities that might not have been at the table before? Frederica, would you like to start?
Well, we don't do it very well at Sea Grant, so I'll acknowledge that right off the bat. One thing that does come to mind, I was talking with our staff about this yesterday, and one thing that might be simple is we're going to have a brick and mortar place. Are we going to have a museum or something there that says come in and know what cyber infrastructure means? Maybe that would be hard to work, but that seems to be one thing that you could do to invite people into a space that was welcoming and share with them what you're trying to do. It makes me think in our conversations in the last breakout, there was so much talk about, it doesn't necessarily mean, you can have a whole different set of skills, but you can all have the same mission to solve or find climate change options. So I think that creating spaces that are welcoming, that could be very physical. I mean, CBL has Chesapeake Biological Lab has a nice visitor center. Will the Cyber Collaboratorium be welcoming like that to the community, to visitors? Something so simple but very tangible.
Yeah, space matters for sure. Brianna, would you like to go?
Yeah, this might still be a bit like philosophical, but that's okay. I think in order to do this work well, it requires a constant stepping outside of yourself and questioning what assumptions am I making, what am I doing that could be uninclusive, where could I make changes, and what do I not know? And that stuff is like very, very uncomfortable, but those are the kind of questions that are important for you to ask yourself. Because when working with people, especially people that you've never worked with before, one of the things I like to tell scientists is like, our work matters so much, and it matters to people that we might not know, and people that we might not never know actually exist, but that is the impact that we have. And so we have to be able to step outside of ourselves and try as hard as we can to place ourselves in the mindset of how can I reach this person, how can I communicate with people that are different than me, and that's a constant like practice day in and day out in order to be able to do this work well.
So this is tough because the side of the street I work on, I really am a community activist. I'm a community-based organizer, not a scientist. And it's important for me to build a bond of trust with the communities that we interact with. And quite frankly, it's a younger man's game because I've spent years volunteering and participating in these communities in ways that aren't directly related to our primary mission, but it builds contacts and relationships and trust. I didn't say it in the presentation, but I blacksmith in 3 of those counties of the 7 in the Patuxent, which puts me in touch with people on a very different level than preaching to them about water quality and that stuff. It allows me to participate in the community as an insider as opposed to an outsider, and most of my staff are involved in quite the same way. It's a little harder, I think, for guys who are researchers and folks who are in the science community to put that kind of time in, and it is a lot of time. And I sit through a lot of evening meetings. Way too many people in this watershed have my cell phone number. You know, it's challenging, but it's enormously empowering in terms of our ability to speak with these communities and collaborate with them. And we think of them as collaborations. We take our marching orders, for the most part, from the communities we serve. And that mentality, I think, not only do people deeply appreciate it, they deeply respect it. actually. And I think that's kind of universal. A few years ago when I was on the board of Waterkeeper, I went to visit the Fundy Baykeeper in Canada. You know, nobody went to see that dude ever in a million years. Boy, did he ever roll out the red carpet, invited all his friends, threw a party. It's like somebody took an interest in his work and came out to see exactly what he was doing. It was very touching. And I think that's true in communities. If you invest yourself in the community, they will invest in you. They will invest in your work. There's a reciprocity that gets created.
So what I'm hearing is work with boundary spanning organizations like the Patuxent River Keeper. That's one thought. It doesn't all have to be in-house knowledge because these relationships take so long to build. And from Brianna, you know, be willing to decenter yourself in order to center community. And definitely, Frederica, thinking of how do we physically make these spaces welcoming and how do we adjust our culture so that folks can walk in and not feel like the PhDs in the room have the mic all the time. So thank you so much for that. And I want to acknowledge there's some amazing questions here, especially the one about distrust of science and legacies of you know, science doing harm in some of these communities, even in our state, specific stories of that harm that we need to be mindful of. So I really want to acknowledge that one. And maybe we can put up the Menti for this one as well. You guys are doing a great job of thinking by writing. I always think by writing, so I appreciate it. And the last one, also a pet question. And I've been thinking about this a lot in the context of culture change, but academic institutions, we are, by definition, focused on the pursuit of knowledge. And in communities, knowledge may not be the primary value. So we have academic settings where that's where our incentives come from. And that's a lot of the definition of what universities do is pursuit of knowledge. But when we start to do this community engagement, we need to figure out how to reckon with those cultural boundary crossings between the values the academic culture shares and those of the community. So UMSE's, I think I do have hope in UMSE's mission that you heard this morning from Chancellor Perman. There is a tradition of UMSE's of trying to have this service be a part of our identity, and just thinking in a very positive, optimistic, Pollyanna-ish way. I'm sure you'll give me a dose of reality too. How can we do that? How do we cross these cultural boundaries and incentives?
I think it takes some humility, a willingness to have that reciprocity, not just talk at people, not just get people on your bandwagon because you need people on your bandwagon, right? There are multiple bandwagons generally at play, and there has to be some room, some airspace, some room to actually embrace all of those values. And there may be community visioning that people are unaware of. Well, a really fast anecdote. I had an environmental justice workshop in a neighborhood. I won't name the neighborhood, but it was a rough place. And a lot of folks came who wanted to connect with that community who didn't know the place. One of those guys came up to me on the lunch break and said, "We need to get these people organized." And I said, "Well, actually, you're kind of a guest here, and I don't think you know where you are." Meanwhile, during lunchtime, someone smashed the window of his car and stole his laptop computer off the front seat. And I thought anybody else in that place who knew where they were wouldn't have left their laptop on that seat. This guy had no idea that he was a fish out of water. And yet, he thought because of his credentials, he was equipped to guide this community. So to me, this is about turf and domain. Turf is where you belong, where you're comfortable, where you're known. Domain is where you can go. And those aren't always the same places, right? Sometimes you can get way off your turf and you're way in over your head because the truth is you don't know the lingo, you don't know the patterns, you don't know anything about where you are as much as you have a business card and some credentials. And so be very mindful of where your own turf is. Learn where your turf is. And if you want to expand that turf, that's going to take some investment. You just can't march in and lay your business card on the table and, as some waterkeepers say, I know a couple of waterkeepers say this and it drives me crazy, "We're the local experts on water." It's like, well, do you know any other experts? I mean, like, have you talked to people in the community? Or all the leading environmentalists are now here. It's like, well, whom are we leading exactly? I mean, you know what I'm saying? There's these presumptions that somehow put us at the center of these presumptions as though the community is supposed to recognize our credentials because we have a business card, because we have a title, because we have a job. And it doesn't work that way in the world. It just doesn't. You know, you have to connect yourself to the community before they will respect those credentials. And the way you get to be a riverkeeper is you do the work. You just can't have the title, oh, I'm the riverkeeper. No, you're only the riverkeeper if people respect you and treat you like the riverkeeper because you do the work. And I think that translates to anything you do.
I think for me, it's really important for all of us to recognize that, like, people have physical needs, people also have, like, spiritual needs. Like, physical is, like, food, water, and shelter, and spiritual is, like, a sense of belonging and inclusion, like, value. And to do not just work with, like, communities, but even just with people in this room and your colleagues, you have to be able to recognize that. So that's, like, the first thing. And then as far as the pursuit of knowledge, if academia is really concerned about, like, the pure pursuit of knowledge, then it should drive you absolutely crazy that there are communities that go unseen and unheard, not their information and their stories and their knowledge is not included in a lot of the things that get published that turn into, like, policy or technology. It should drive you absolutely crazy that that is something that is completely normalized and sustained within our society. And I think the last thing you also have to ask yourself is academia flexible enough to be able to include all of those needs, the physical and the spiritual needs of people, and to also be flexible enough to be able to take in that new information and those experiences that have been left out for so many years.
That was great, Brianna. Thank you. Frederica, you got to follow that. I don't know.
Yeah, it makes me think, you know, hearing you both, the humility and the grace in which we need to carry with us in everything and everywhere we go is really important. Talking about the cyber collaboratory, I think it's really important that we decide what are the knowledge, pure science questions that need to be answered. And what are the questions we're answering because we think they're going to help society cope with what's happening in climate change. And so make that distinction and then go talk to whoever it is you think is that person, that group, that community, that organization that may or may not really be affected the way you think they're going to be by your ideas about climate change. And I have to say, Sea Grant's been trying to do this for a long time. We try work with communities, and I really think it's important to re-emphasize what Brianna says. You need to go in with a humility that you accept people in their spaces and their locations and homes and their communities understand their communities. They have their own knowledge base. They have a strong sense of their own place. And you need to let that be articulated and then welcome that knowledge as equal to your own knowledge. And I think from there together, where you find yourselves on the recognition of an equal knowledge basis and a willing to listen and learn other people's languages, whether it's in different disciplines or across cultural differences. I think combining all those together is the ideal of where we try to get, but it's hard work, but it can be done. It just don't shy away from it and don't let the barriers of systemic racism be so strong that you just want to fold up the tent. You just can't do that. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you all so much. So we might have one more Mentimeter around this question. I hope this was really thought-provoking. Are there any ideas any of you still have at the tip of your tongues that you'd like to end with?
Yeah, there's a corollary that I just remembered because I spent some years in Amherst, Massachusetts, where my father was teaching at the University of Mass. And there, the tradition of town meetings was still very much alive. And that's a tradition in New England where people can fight like crazy and still be friends when they walk out at the end of the evening. So I do think there's also a further problem, is that our culture has become so uncivil. It's become so difficult to talk about controversial stuff in a meeting without shots being fired or metal detectors at the entrance. I mean, I'm exaggerating a little bit, but only a little bit. So I do think we have to work on connecting better, but also toning down a little bit, taking the accelerant out of the room so we can have meaningful and constructive conversations, you know? In our case, we're trying to take community rage sometimes and translate it into constructive action, which is an exercise in civility and in thinkingness and mindfulness and connecting with people on their own terms. And mediation has taught me quite a lot about that. I have a lot of hours, both in law school and outside of law school, and I still mediate to keep those skills fresh. And that comes with those skills some of the time, your ability to not only listen acutely to what people are saying, but to also kind of get on their page, get on their wavelength. So it's a skill you have to work on. You'll spend your entire life working on these skills, is my take on it.
Yeah, I think for just the last things, I think as scientists we get stuck in a I'm the expert mentality. I've went to school, I have a degree, I've been doing this for decades. To really just think about what would it mean to you to not know, to learn, to realize that maybe you were wrong about something, to kind of just open the door for you to be wrong and have a different perspective or a different experience. What could you gain from that?
They've said it all.
So I see a lot of really good questions. I do want to acknowledge from both the last session and this session, there have been questions on accessibility, even around this summit today and how we might make this a more accessible event. And I think that that's something that we always need to remember as well, that when we think about broadening who's at the table, it's not just about race and ethnicity, but a lot of social identities that sometimes get left out.
About specific identities, that many people who identify as black in Baltimore have an understandable distrust of science. Well, there's the Henrietta Lack thing, and there's a bunch of other stuff too. Just like lawyers, I think sometimes scientists get demonized, and I know plenty of communities that don't want anything to do with people studying them. They're really upset about that idea. So I don't know if there's a natural answer about how to deal with distrust if there's an ethnic bias. I don't know that there is or there isn't, but I think where there is such a bias, it's understandable because there's a history, typically. It's not because people saw a conspiracy video on YouTube. They probably have a direct negative experience with somebody who presented themselves as a scientist, and something transpired. And so, again, I don't know how to deal with that. I think if you're simpatico, you can go a long way. If you're good at people, you can go a long way regardless, I think. People respond to eye contact and your presence and your presentation. And I think, like I said, I think that's a skill that people build and polish and hone over time to get along with folks. I know guys, I'm thinking of a guy who's 4 feet tall, Dave, used to work for me in the video business. He could walk to the tallest guy in a bar and say, "So what's up, shorty?" and not get punched out because he projected a sense of harmlessness. He was really good at that. I saw that guy get through so many difficult situations because he was able to disarm people with his natural presence. So that's a good skill, I think,
Well, and maybe from our side as academicians, having some understanding of these histories and making sure that the folks at the collaboratory know that because sometimes scientists don't even know all of these histories because they aren't taught explicitly. So, and having the skills and emotional intelligence are maybe important.
Or talking to each other a lot, and we forget there's a fourth wall. That was really, I forgot to tell you the title of my talk this morning. Let's break that fourth wall. On stage is the people talking to each other in character. Out there is the people who aren't on stage, and we need to be talking to them. We need to bring them into the fold. So focus on that fourth wall and vaporizing it.
I thought the ChatGPT question was a little bit interesting, and I don't know, my reaction to it was, if we're going into a community, I'm going to make the a priori assumption that they may be more competent at different types of technology than I am. And so I think there is really, I imagine more people are using ChatGPT from all kinds of different walks of life than I am. And so I'd like to learn from them. So I think it's really important that we are making it accessible through training, through education, through all the things you've been talking about at the table, internships, how we bring people into the community, how we build from within the communities we're reaching, that the capability and the capacity to lead within their communities. And I think that is a role in which the universities, NGOs, Sea Grants can work together to do. But I think we need to be very intentional that our idea is not to go in and be extractive of communities, but to go in and build up those communities so they can guide us. Because they're the ones, you're presumably, at least if you're Sea Grant, you're in a community because they're going underwater or they're having a fishing crisis. There is some issue that's environmentally related that you would like to help bring science and engagement to solve. And so you need to learn from them what the problem needs to be solved. So I think there's a lot that we can contribute through the structures that we have in place now if we just use them thoughtfully and reach communities we haven't traditionally reached, and just do that intentionally.
Yeah, we can't go in with a deficit model because your trust building will collapse from the get-go. All right, we got the signal and Brianna saw it and I didn't. So thank you all so much. Can we give our panelists a round of applause?